You're listening to Pondering Pennies with Dempsy and Rae.
Welcome back to the latest episode of Pondering Pennies. Today we have Colin on, an old friend from back home, known him for over a decade, went to school together. He ended up joining the Army after high school. Colin, can you introduce yourself to the people?
Good morning. Thanks for having me on, Dempsey. So my background in the Army is with cavalry reconnaissance, and I have over 9 years of experience in that.
Nice. When is my understanding with Calv, they kind of have two main tracks to them, light and heavy. Have you had experience with both those things?
Yes. So basically my career has been split in half, with the first half being in the light cav, and now currently I'm with the heavy cav. So the major distinction between them is the implementation of dismounted personnel. You find in the light side of cavalry reconnaissance that dismounts are employed far more frequently. And you also have a lighter vehicle platform. So we're talking about light armored wheeled vehicles as our primary platform. And then in the heavy side, we're talking about a heavily armored tracked vehicle. And unfortunately, in the heavy side, dismounts are employed far less frequently.
Now, on the heavy side, are dismounts used less frequently due to like the firepower that is equipped with the heavy side versus the light side, or generally when, employed in battle, they just have two different mission sets?
So what it boils down to is the way that the heavy armor is employed, and also its limitations. So in the light side of things, you have wheeled vehicles, which have a much lower noise footprint. And so the element of surprise of stealth is much easier to maintain. And so when you're already being stealthy and your location isn't being compromised by a large noisy vehicle, then you can actually function as reconnaissance is supposed to, by pushing out those dismounts and moving slowly and cautiously. Now, that's kind of negated in the heavy side because we have these massive tracked vehicles that are incredibly noisy. And so the rationale with a lot of commanders is, why am I even going to send out these dismounts? Because anywhere I send them, they have to be close enough to have sustainment from the tracks. And so it's just not even worthwhile. Now, I'm not saying there isn't any utility in using those dismounts. I'm just saying oftentimes where they would come in handy, it's negated by the massive noise footprint of those track vehicles.
Track, and if you could have your pick of the litter, which one would you decide to stay with for the rest of your career?
Okay, so there's a lot that goes into the dynamics of both of those types of organizations. And there are many merits and detracting factors to be observed about either. My personal preference is the light side of things. I find that light units tend to have more esprit de corps. They tend to be generally more fit. They get to train far more frequently than do heavy units. And some of that's pretty intuitive. When you have wheeled vehicles, the maintenance entailed is considerably less than it is with tracked vehicles. And it's also considerably less expensive for a wheeled unit to go to the field than it is for a tracked one. If you think about the unit costs between, say, a Humvee and a Bradley, it's remarkably disparate. We're talking like 10 times more expensive for the Brad, at least, than for the Humvee.
So it really sounds like that esprit de corps and that enthusiasm for professional arms comes out on the light side, because you're more engaged in those combat tactics versus more so on the heavy side, almost falling into the role of a mechanic, basically.
Yes. So there's also some inherent flaws, I would say, with the organization of our heavy units. And it lends itself to that lack of esprit de corps that you often see in heavy units. And I am not saying by any means that there aren't heavy units that are all gung-ho and they love what they do. I know plenty of people in all the units that I've been that are that way. But I would say it's just more pervasive in the light side of things. And the reason for that is when somebody joins combat arms, they have an expectation that they're going to be trained on individual tasks and drills, that they're going to be proficient on battle drills. At least I had that expectation. Even going into the cavalry, as distinct from the infantry, I had this notion that I was going to be trained up on this stuff all the time. And when I was in a light unit, because the troopers will be dismounted for a good portion of the time, their individual soldier competencies are something that the NCOs, the leaders, were always trying to refine and to develop. And so there was this pride and this investment in the unit that was fostered with lower enlisted. And you get to the heavy side of things, and there just simply isn't the time for that, because there's so much maintenance entailed for the heavy tracked vehicles that what ends up happening to these troopers that joined to be fighters, they end up spending all their time conducting maintenance on their vehicle and laying out different pieces of equipment so that accountability can be retained.
Why do you think there isn't a system in place where there is support personnel attached to the unit to perform that maintenance? I understand if you're out in the field and you're conducting ops, something breaks, it's important to be familiar with your equipment and be able to troubleshoot on the spot. But as far as, back on station, back home at your base, as well, it seems like that would be beneficial to provide more avenues of training, more free time to those people. And then, you know what I mean? It's almost like in other branches, obviously like with helicopters and airplanes and stuff, I'm assuming they have support personnel, and it's not the pilots conducting all the maintenance operations, or, the gunner on the side of the helicopter conducting all the operations. I'm sure they know basic, how to make the stuff works.
Yep.
As far as upkeep and everything, why there isn't support people.
You are absolutely spot on with that observation. And that's a point that I've often made, and I'm not alone in that. I talk to senior leaders about, what we can do to refine the organization to make things flow the way that they should. And I think the major impediment to that with regard to heavy cav is the fact that, yes, we have these maintenance teams. We do. We have mechanics assigned to every troop. But the issue is that there aren't enough of them. I believe that in order to streamline our systems, what we need to do is have a mechanic per track, because each track has a myriad of different issues that could go wrong with it. And when you're taking a scout, the operating personnel, they simply don't have the knowledge base to diagnose and troubleshoot all of the issues. So a lot of time, I don't want to say is wasted, but that's basically what's happening. Our drivers, the people that are supposed to maintain the tracks, they have a very tenuous grasp of what could be going wrong with that track. And so there's a lot of wasted time between them trying to diagnose it, getting the mechanics having them work on it. Sometimes the mechanics work on it. It's just a very lengthy, tedious process. And the byproduct of that is a lot of times when we need to go to the field, maybe all of our tracks are not fully operationally ready. And as with any military organization, you want to maximize how many vehicles are actually fully ready. So in order to fix that, what I think the Army should do is to recruit more mechanics, and we need to assign them, because I'm sure, like you were referencing, with any aviation, there's probably a crew of mechanics assigned to a specific vehicle. And we don't even have a mechanic per vehicle at all. So I think there should be a permanent fixtured mechanic assigned to a vehicle, and they can address all the maintenance concerns. And if they need help, they can say, hey, to the driver, help me out with this. But they will be the repository of all the knowledge and the troubleshooting ability. Because without that, these young drivers, these troopers, are not getting time to work on actual scout skills, on reconnaissance. Honestly, the bulk of their time is spent doing things related to the maintenance of the Brad.
Now, do you think that's an issue on the DoD side with recruiting, with not having enough mechanics and it's just a manning shortfall? Do you think that's an issue with misallocation of personnel, or is there any kind of unit within the Army that exists for manpower studies to make sure that manning and staffing levels are adequate to fulfill the needs of the unit?
Well, I don't know exactly at what level this occurs, and it's not a glaring flaw. I mean, our heavy units are fully functional, absolutely competent. I'm just saying this is a way we can improve. We can get better, and we can also boost up our retention numbers if you have soldiers that are invested and that feel like they are a soldier. Every time, I remember when I was lower enlisted before I was a leader, and I felt when I was doing maintenance, number one, it was kind of like drudgery. And number two, it's not what I signed up to be. I was not a mechanic. I signed up to be combat arms. I signed up to do reconnaissance. And that's recognizing, of course, that there's a lot entailed in your enlistment that you may be unaware of. And that's not like a neglect of whatever duty, or I'm just saying it was perceptual for me. I felt like this is outside of the scope of what I signed up for, and I did not enjoy doing the maintenance. And I had specifically chosen combat arms so I wouldn't have to do something like that. And because I wanted to be a soldier. In my mind, a mechanic is a mechanic, and a soldier is somebody that does war fighting. So anyway.
Yeah, you it's easy reading the fine print. Sometimes you don't realize the monotonous tasks that go into enabling the more, I don't know if I want to call it glorious, but you know what I mean, the more sought after aspect of a job title.
Well, and I'll give you some anecdotes on that. So when I was in Hawaii, when I was a part of a light unit, we had basically 1 day per week that we would conduct our maintenance in. And it was fairly rare for us to devote our time to that outside of that 1 day. And so for the rest of the week, for the rest of the work week, those 4 remaining days, we were working on any number of different things. 1 day we could do battle drills. 1 day it could be OP emplacement. 1 day it could be sector sketches, what have you. And every day we're brushing up on a different soldier competency. And it was exciting. It was educational, and it built confidence in the leadership that I have. And again, this is just me. Plenty of leaders and stuff within heavy organizations are fully enthusiastic about the platform and all of that. But my preference is light because of those previously stated reasons.
Now, with the last 20 years, right, the U.S. has obviously had a certain kind of mission set and theater of operation in mind with its military, and we've been fighting insurgencies and not really a conventional force at all. And obviously the terrain and environment has been some kind of way. With those operations kind of winding down, a main focus, what appears to me in the, Asian Pacific region, even with the Russia-Ukraine conflict going on, and what seems to be like either maintaining or even maybe a slight ramp up of operations in Africa. What do you think coming out of our current theater fighting, those atypical warfare styles can we take away, if any, to implement on a conventional force?
So our reconnaissance has to occur on a broader scale. And when we're talking about more open, less restrictive environments, potential theaters of conflict, that lends itself more to the heavy side of things. But you could also find endless utility for the silent, more clandestine, light side of the scout world. But previously, particularly with the GWAT, there was more implementation. Not early GWAT. Early GWAT, it was everybody, but mid to late, because of restrictive terrain and whatnot, a lot of light units were being implemented and used. Because, take for example, Afghanistan, you have rocky mountains. There's no way you're going to manipulate or negotiate that terrain with a massive tracked vehicle. You're going to have to use dismounts. So again, there's dismounts in both sides, but light units were more beneficial there. And then moving back to conventional warfare with less restrictive terrain and larger scale forces, I think there's going to be a lot more reliance on the heavy cav.
On the Army side of things, when it comes to, I think a lot of people learned during GWAT. A lot of times some things are kind of learned as you go and, adapt and overcome through trial and error. Does the Army have any plans to decrease and increase number of light units versus heavy units as they prep for the next conflict? Or is it kind of like a status quo, if that makes sense? Are we looking to deactivate some light units to stand up more heavy units, or how does that all work if they decide they need to make a change?
Well, I don't know. That's a DoD question, but I would anticipate that we will retain significant numbers of both. Like I said, there'll probably just be more of a reliance on heavy. And also another factor I don't think I maybe touched on is, in terms of firepower, it's not really close. So when you contrast a heavy unit with a light unit, the heavy unit has far more firepower, and they can also soak up a lot more of the enemy's fire than can a light unit. So if you're using it as a decisive force, again, where our primary function is as reconnaissance, but if you have tracked vehicles, your ability to conduct reconnaissance in a clandestine manner is greatly limited. So I think, if anything, we'll see probably more use of heavy cav and also of true cav. So cavalry reconnaissance is not true cavalry, because we are not supposed to be the decisive force. The true cavalry would be your tankers. They will actually close with the enemy in general. And at least conceptually, my side of things, the recon side of things, we're not supposed to. But we can if you're in a heavy unit, because you have the firepower, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. As we start to see more posturing from near peer threats like Russia and China, do you think we even consider Russia as a near peer threat anymore? Or do you think they've kind of shown their hand, that they're more of a paper tiger on the world stage, where, they have this massive country and resources and manpower to pull from, but at least in the beginning stages of the Ukraine conflict here, I believe they've kind of shown that they are either incompetent or, incapable for whatever reason of conducting combined arms tactics. And when it comes to a traditional fight in the 21st century, I don't see how digging trenches and relying on artillery till they turn everything into rubble in front of you, and then moving that artillery to the rubble to turn the next thing into rubble, is going to be able to stand against combined arm tactics amongst multiple branches in a competent first world military that isn't Ukraine.
Yeah. So I agree with pretty much all of that assessment. I think the recent conflict in the Ukraine has been very revelatory. A lot of, I don't want to say the free world, but the West, a lot of the West then, we had this notion ever since the conclusion of the Cold War that the Russians were a near peer threat, that they were something we had to prepare for. And I mean, if you even think about when you go to the range, what they call those pop-up targets, they call them Ivans. It's a suggestion that the people we're training to fight are the Russians. And obviously that's reminiscent of the Cold War era, but we've had this notion built up in our minds, and it's largely, well, it's really only from the Cold War that we've created this, because Russia's been on the decline militarily since then. And there's been an effort from Putin to try and bolster nationalism, to try and bolster their military. But as a result of this invasion of the Ukraine, we have really seen how ineffectual that's been. And I think it's less due to the lack of initiative in terms of the Russian government, and more due to the economic limitations of the Russian economy. So it doesn't matter how much nationalism Putin can foster in the country, and he has to a great extent, but the Russian population isn't growing, the Russian economy isn't growing, and a lot of that is due to the authoritarianism of the Putin regime. So when you consider all these factors, I would not reference Russia as a near peer threat. Their economy could not sustain an extended war with a more powerful country. And in terms of a more powerful country, there's two off the top of the list that you could consider, and that would be the United States and China.
When it comes to naysayers about sending aid to Ukraine, personally, to me, it seems like the perfect example of a proxy war where we are trading US dollars instead of US lives to get a clear picture of Russia's capabilities in an armed conflict. What are your thoughts on the actual benefits of these dollars going to Ukraine? Because I think a lot of people, what they don't realize is when the government passes a bill for $50 billion of aid to Ukraine, that's not like a wire going through Zelle to Zelensky's bank account. What they're actually doing is they are giving $50 billion worth of equipment, be it tanks, rockets, ammunition, whatever. And in return, once that price tag of $50 billion or whatever, they pass at that time gets hit, that amount of money is allocated into the U.S. economy to actually restock that equipment. And that's kind of feeds into that whole military industrial complex. The war machine keeps turning, but it's not like we're just giving Zelensky a check.
Right. So to answer that question, you have to ponder the question of are our contributions actually proving to be decisive over there? And I would say that they are. And with somebody as aggressive as Putin being left to his devices, as he was in previous administrations, when he invaded Crimea, for example, there was no one standing in his way, no one telling him no, and we've learned from history that appeasement does not work very well. Just ask Neville Chamberlain about that. So if you're asking me personally, I say, yes, we are doing something very utilitarian for both of those reasons. Anything that is in contravention of Putin's interests or objectives, I will stand behind. We're also projecting influence indirectly, and we're sending a message to people that are on the receiving end of invading forces that we will assist. And I think that is a very positive thing. And if anything, it's going to help our global image. So the only thing I will say to that is that maybe we don't need to send so much, because there are domestic issues that we could be directing those funds to. And I think that's what a lot of Americans take issue with, is just the sheer volume of funds that are being sent there in the form of ordinance, like you said. But there are American problems, organic problems that need to be addressed. And yes, we can help, but maybe not to the extent that we are. And we don't fully know how effective our contributions are. I think the Ukrainians are doing a phenomenal job of repelling this invasion. And they would probably be holding on even without the contributions of the West. Although obviously we're making it much easier for them.
Do you think that goes back to, with possible too generous of contributions, where the U.S. is constantly seen as this world police force? I mean, I don't think there is any member other than Poland of NATO besides the U.S. that actually meets their spending obligations to the treaty. Do you think that the U.S. should be asking, more help from other countries around the world that are providing aid to Ukraine, or maybe some kind of set agreement of X amount of GDP, where obviously as the largest economy by far in the world, that's, still $10 trillion ahead of China as the second. They might not be able to give as much, but on a ratio basis, obviously that isn't even lining up either. Yeah,
absolutely. I think it's a very negative thing. I don't want to use strong language, but there's some absurdity to it even. You have all these different NATO countries talking about the United States and how we have this propensity for warmongering and even imperialism. And there's historical irony in that, but there's also situational irony in that we are their defense plan and they are not paying their share. Like that's not just nonsense. It's not just a talking point. They literally do not sink funds into their budget for defense because they know at the end of the day, when the Russians come, American money at the very least is going to be there to defend them, and more likely American troops. So absolutely, if there's any way we can, I don't want to say coerce, but encourage our NATO allies to pick up more of their own defense bill, that would be a boon for all of the West.
Not to dive too deep on this tangent, but what are your thoughts on Poland stating that they will be the new military powerhouse on the European continent? And I think by 2030, they said they plan on having their military spending up to 5% of their GDP. Do you think that is based in historical context, where they exist on a wide open plain between two countries that have been historically aggressive towards them? Or do you think they maybe see perhaps a decline in the Eurozone, with the economy not seeing as much strength as the rest of the world coming out of COVID, and the UK leaving? Or, what do you think's going on there?
I think perhaps it's a little overly optimistic. Obviously, countries like to make broad sweeping claims about their capabilities. But personally, I would love to see that. I would love to see a bolstered Polish military. And also, as the historian in me, really likes to see that as well, because if you look at it from that context, through that lens, Poland has always been a dramatic military power. And it really wasn't reduced or ended the martial capabilities of the Poles until right before World War II, where they just got steamrolled by the Germans. But prior to that, Poland has always been a central player in Eastern European politics. And they have, like you said, been a buffer between the Germans and the Russians. So, yeah, I think that'd be great for the area. Now, as long as the Poles are firmly aligned with NATO, and in not somehow aligned with Putin, then that's going to be great for Europe. Another deterring nation with a very illustrious military history to stand between Putin and his ends.
with the Ukraine war, and I feel like Putin overplayed his hand and did not expect the military aid or the sanctions response that the West was going to put in place and how swiftly those things occurred. To me, it seems like China, if they were competent at anything at all, are writing everything down as it happens and creating their playbook for Taiwan. Do you think the swiftness and decisiveness of the West coming to the aid of Ukraine has deterred them at all and possibly pushed back any plans for Taiwan?
Well, I should hope so. And again, I want to be optimistic about this because people are not recognizing how grave the potential threat is with this whole Taiwan-China thing. So I hope against hope, that the Chinese are watching and they are deterred by this. Because if they're not, and they think that we are only going to send aid to Taiwan, because that's not going to cut it with Taiwan. When you talk about the geographical disparity between mainland China and Taiwan, and then also the difference in population, when you consider these factors, it would take actual boots on the ground, not just financial aid, to assist actual American planes, actual American ships. So I think cooler heads are prevailing for the time being, because even the Chinese, the war hawks in the CCP, I'm sure they recognize what will actually happen should they decide to invade, to steamroll Taiwan.
With China, so obviously Russia this isn't their first rodeo. They've had military incursions into Crimea. They've had military incursions into Georgia. We haven't really seen small conflicts, border skirmishes with China, expanding territory like we have with the Russians. So we really don't, I feel like, have a real world scenario look into China's military operations and capabilities. I mean, they clearly commit, monetary manipulation with the yuan. They clearly lie about their demographics when it comes to Asian population. They lie about their GDP. So at what point do you believe the liar when it then comes to their military? Do you think there is a world where China does make a play for Taiwan and they are just as completely incompetent as conducting combined arms tactics like Russia is? Or do you think they're capable of actually taking the island and not just having their boats sink in the strait with hundreds of thousands of men drowning to their death?
They are fully capable of taking Taiwan. I have no doubts about that. But I think the only thing preventing me or preventing them from actually doing that is the repercussions, the ramifications. So they are acting cautiously. They're learning from how we respond to Putin with more aggressive, more overt actions. But I think what they're doing now is they're posturing and they're trying to draw as much information as they can. They're flying all kinds of warplanes around Taiwan. They're scrambling naval vessels surrounding, intimidating Taiwan. There's all kinds of drones in the air. It's just nonstop. And they're seeing how far they can push and how the West is going to respond to that. Because Taiwan will put up some kind of a defense, but it just simply would not be enough on their own. So, yeah, like I said, it's very grim, the prospect of this. And I hope that the Chinese recognize what will unfold. And it seems like they do, because they haven't taken it yet, and they absolutely could have.
As we come out of COVID and the war between Russia and Ukraine continues, I feel like we're seeing a slight trend towards deglobalization across the world as countries realize that it is important not to outsource absolutely everything in your economy, because then you as a country are only as strong as the supply chains. Do you think that growing trend will embolden China in taking Taiwan, because at that point they become less economically entangled with the West? And do you think as this war between Russia and Ukraine goes on, I could easily see this as being, their 1980 version of Afghanistan all over again? Do you think at a certain point, if the West becomes too entangled with that and the decoupling of economies, Taiwan becomes more and more alluring to China?
So I think that's a major motivating factor in preventing them from invasion. The globalization aspect and the intertwined economies, they know that is at stake. And they know that all of that is going to fall by the wayside should they undertake aggressive actions. So that may even be the major factor, the number one factor preventing them from doing that.
With China obviously being a major manufacturer, they haven't made that leap yet that most first world countries had to the service industry kind of things. So obviously they're highly susceptible to sanctions at that point. Then if people don't buy their things, that's kind of the whole crutch of their economy, right?
Yes.
So with China, sorry, go
ahead. You're also seeing right now the Taiwanese economy is falling into arrears because of posturing by the Chinese, and also because demand for Taiwanese products has decreased of late. And I think a lot of that is due to countries manufacturing those different things organically as opposed to importing them from Taiwan. And another thing to consider is the United States isn't the only one that is economically beholden to China. The Chinese have been extending their influence very subtly, mind you, across the globe. They're building infrastructure. You see them all across of southern Africa, where the Chinese are buying up tracts of land. They're building infrastructure. They're building roads. They're building hospitals. They're building schools. And what that is doing is building up a favorable image of the Chinese, so that if it ever comes to the point where the United States and China are in open conflict, vying for global hegemony, maybe all these countries where the Chinese already exert influence will align themselves with the CCP.
With what do you think? I understand the history between China and Taiwan, and Taiwan's government being the former government of China that fled when the Red Army won the war. But what really does China have to gain from taking Taiwan? Like, at this point, China demographically and economically and military is the dominant power over Taiwan. And the US and Taiwan have said multiple times already, like, the minute they move in and it seems like they are going to win, all the semiconductor factories, all those things would immediately be destroyed, and the workers at those factories would immediately be brought over to the US in a Nazi scientist post-German loss-esque way. So what, outside of we say we're going to do this, therefore we're going to do this type of attitude, what do they even have to gain?
I think it would be primarily just international standing. We're talking about a small island of ethnically Chinese people, where if you didn't have the historical context and all the grievances involved, it would seem by rights Taiwan should be a part of China. But when you factor in all those, then of course they have their standing. So I think that's primarily what they would benefit from. And also, I think China wants to benefit economically from all the manufacturing in Taiwan. And I understand they already do to a certain extent indirectly, but then they would have direct control over all of these products that are produced in Taiwan, and they'd have that angle on the global market. So besides that, I do still believe that the primary reason that they want it is because they feel that they're entitled to it, that it should be theirs. It would be, I think they view it as if, in much the same way that the United States did when the Civil War happened and several states seceded from the Union. I think that's how the Chinese view Taiwan.
Interesting. When it comes to moving past sanctions and weaponizing economies, how much can the U.S. rely on partnerships and treaties built, such as NATO, to assist in that fight? Because obviously, any NATO allies over the last 20 years have been assisting the U.S. in fighting a counterinsurgency. And most of them have decreased military spending and posturing since World War II and haven't been involved in a major conflict since World War II. Are they even ready to come to our aid in that manner?
So there's only a few NATO allies that would be able to contribute in any dramatic manner. And I think the GWOT is a good frame of reference for what their military projection capabilities are. So you saw the British send substantial forces, and even the Germans, they possessed the capability to, but they didn't deploy in large numbers in support of that. So I don't know that we can rely on NATO to assist militarily that much. Number one, because the United States has such a massive Navy and an Air Force that even if our NATO allies were to send their entire naval and Air Force capabilities, it would only be a drop in the bucket relative to the rest of the United States contributions. But I can promise you, if something does happen, they're not even going to do that, because they're going to be concerned about defense, and also they're going to be concerned about not further antagonizing China. And that brings up another point. You see the French already aligning themselves, making deals with China, talking about how they're not going to intervene. And maybe it's just a publicity stunt because they don't believe the Chinese are actually going to do anything with Taiwan, but specifically the French, who are very militarily capable. We've witnessed this, and people don't know this, but the French are active militarily all across North Africa. To this day, there's ongoing military operations by the French. And they've proven themselves very capable. They have a strong economy. They have a strong military, and they would be a beneficial ally. And it seems like they are aligning themselves with the Chinese, or at least they are going to be neutral should conflict boil over. And that is a very scary prospect, because if we are going to engage in conflict with China, we need every ally we can find.
When it comes to something like that, obviously on the political world stage, words matter. So even if they're not put in stone in the form of a treaty or pact or anything, what kind of message does that send to the rest of the NATO allies when you have one of the premier powers in NATO actively saying, yeah, we're probably not going to get involved?
Well, I think it's despicable. And part of the justification for that, you have Macron talking about how the United States is this imperialist power and we're always getting embroiled in conflicts that don't concern us. But there's some irony in that. Again, I mean, who is a greater imperial power than the French and the British, historically speaking? And he's trying to say that, in the modern age, it's the United States. And what he actually means by that is he doesn't want to jeopardize the economic relationship between the French and China. And I think that's absolutely despicable. And I hope that France is the only country that aligns itself and we don't see more of this from, say, the British or the Germans. Because like I said, if it comes to war, and I mean, hopefully it doesn't, but if it does come to war, we're going to need a unified front to face the Chinese.
Yeah, I find it very funny when France kind of has like a quasi control over some dozen countries in Africa still post decolonization of Africa, that they would say things like the US is a modern day imperial power when they are still, for a lack of nuanced terms, balls deep in there. Still
Right.
pretty hypocritical.
Well, and they're taking a note from the Chinese playbook. They're influencing these countries more clandestinely. So maybe they don't have military bases there, but they have military forces there to assist the native government with training. But those forces are also there to exert influence.
100%. For outside allies, who do you think the US can really count on outside of NATO to come to assist in the fight?
Outside of NATO, well,
like obviously, to me, Japan is like the first one that jumps to mind.
Right. So there's Japan and there's also India to consider. But the jury is still kind of out on where India is going to align itself, because we have close economic relationships with India. We have, well, I don't want to say a close military relationship with them, but we often conduct training exercises with the Indian Army. And then governmentally, they are more aligned with us than, say, China. So the Indians, whatever stance they take with whichever country they align themselves, I think very much could prove decisive, rather, because they share an extensive border with China. And so if we can get some kind of guarantee from the Indians that they will at least be neutral in the conflict, if not actively aligned with the West, that would be a great thing for the world. And then, of course, the Japanese are very close allies. There's no way that they would ever align themselves with the Chinese. So that is a major benefit to us and for the potential conflict.
Do you ever see World War III being the catalyst? US versus China. US versus China goes down in Taiwan. 10 years from now, Russia is still involved in Ukraine. Chaos is occurring. North Korea sees their move for South Korea, and it's just like a cascading effect from there.
So, I mean, there's all kinds of hypotheticals and different scenarios that could play out, and we can discuss them. But I think whatever happens, Russia is going to be a secondary player, and I think because of the economic capability of China, they are going to have to be at the forefront of whatever happens. Because as it stands now, in terms of global standing, there's no other contenders. It's going to be the United States. It's going to be China for some time. Though I don't see this bleeding over into an actual armed conflict, because both parties involved recognize what that would entail for the world.
Do you see the possibility? I've seen some talks recently of a kind of a secondary alliance treaty grouping, almost similar to the BRICS partnership going on, but like predominantly white English Anglo-Saxon speaking countries, with like the UK, Ireland, Canada, the US, New Zealand, Australia coming together at all, due to like very similar cultural and background ties? Or do you think that's kind of a wish in the well?
Well, we already have that in varying degrees. I mean, the entire Anglosphere, that, by the way, that's the encapsulating term, all those culturally similar countries. The Anglosphere is already very closely aligned, and I don't see anything happening to change that. Now, with that being said, France is also our oldest ally. And yet they seem to have cozied up to China more than to us. So that's very troubling. And if France can do it, then who's to say the UK won't do it? I think it's unlikely. And again, I'm just talking about statements made by Macron. As far as I know, France has not actually officially aligned itself in any way with China. But it's still troubling when world leaders say things like that. And like I said, if it could happen in France, it could happen anywhere across the Anglosphere.
Is there any benefit to deglobalization? Do you think the people, because of COVID, have woken up to that, and that will be a continued earnest effort around the world? Or do you think economies are just too accustomed to easy, cheap labor in China? Or do you think kind of a different route, as China continues to, come up when it comes to their standard of living and increased wages? Do you think it's almost kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy where you see production and labor leave China to other places like, say, India, because India is the new China of 2000?
So do I think it's favorable? Yes. I like to see, obviously, particularly in the United States, I want to see us be more self-reliant. I want us to produce our goods here and to sell them here. And the less foreign reliance we can foster in this country, and I'm not just going to say the United States, I'm going to say across the West, across all of our allies. I want to see them be more self-reliant and less reliant, particularly on awful authoritarian regimes. And I'm not saying everywhere that we get cheaper products and goods and labor, they're all authoritarian regimes. I'm just saying, like, we are very dependent on countries like China and countries like Saudi Arabia, where in terms of their values and their governments, we have no natural alliance. There's no natural overlap of values. So I would like to see less reliance on them and more reliance on organic manufacturing and resourcing of different products. Now, at the same time, inevitably, those products, those goods and services are all going to be much more expensive as a result. So, I mean, it's an inevitability, but the long-term effect on the nation is a net positive, despite the short-term inaccessibility of whatever, the latest iPhone.
Do you think with Trump kind of started the quote unquote trade war of China from 2016 to 2020, but I feel like a lot of people fail to recognize economically Biden has really continued that trend and even taken, in some cases, a harsher approach, especially when it comes to things like the chip manufacturing industry. Do you think increased blockades like that, where Biden states if you work in this industry and you work for China, you either continue working for them or you're a U.S. citizen, the choice is yours, or increased tariffs are a catalyst for something like that, at the very least, those industries moving out of China, if not the coming to the U.S. directly?
I'm sorry, what was the question in that?
Do you think, when we're stating kind of like all homegrown economies, self-sufficient within your own borders, do you think policies like that or just straight up increased tariffs will lead to that? Or will people just move on to the next cheap labor economy from China to India instead?
Oh, okay. Gotcha. So I recognize it's wishful thinking to think that the American consumer is going to buy American as long as there's another cheaper alternative. I mean, I'll give you a personal example. I just bought a gift for a nephew, and it was cheaper to the tune of about a quarter of the price to buy from China versus buying the exact same American thing. So yes, the consumer is always going to choose the cheaper option, and I don't think that this is something that we're going to see, the self-reliance, and that people will buy American. Obviously, that would be great. And I think if we make fewer economic deals, and so that we basically narrow the okay, this sounds like a negative thing, but it's really not, where you narrow exactly the pool of resources that the consumer has to choose from, so that they only have an organic option. That would probably be a good thing. long term, but it's simply not going to happen because there always will be a cheaper option from a foreign source.
I feel like some people do subscribe to the buy once cry once motto though, so I feel like there is, and obviously if you are buying something like tape, okay, tape is tape. you can get the 25-cent tape that came from China versus I don't know if $5 tape exists, but you know what I mean. But there is certain things like electronics and whatnot, you buy once, cry once. Yeah, it was a pretty penny, but it's quality built and it's going to last you a lifetime. And it seems like to me that the younger generations are much less consumer oriented than past generations like the boomer and Gen X. Do you think that's going to be a trend that continues at all that might kind of get us on that track? Or do you think capitalism is just kind of lends itself to, always, as long as it's produced good enough to work and at the cheapest amount, people are going to consume those products?
So personally, I haven't observed that trend. I hope it is occurring. I noticed that as I get older, I tend to buy more expensive, longer lasting, generally American produced type of goods, just because of the quality disparity and also because I have more financial freedom. But I think younger people tend to not really care. And they're also the ones that are generally buying the cheaper products. So if that is happening, that's great. And that's great for the American long-term economy. But I don't know that it is. And I don't know that's something that's been borne out by the economic figures.
Tracking. Yeah, for some reason, I feel like it could just be 100% anecdotal, and it's just my own personal experience on a very small scale. But that's what I feel like I have been witnessing. But speaker of this younger generation, I feel like I'm always hearing that the military is having issue with an ever shrinking pool of potential recruits, and then an even further shrinking pool of people that are even interested in joining. Do you think the military has a PR problem and they're just not connecting with people, or what's going on there?
So to answer that question, there is a number of different factors that contribute to the public perception that the military isn't a viable career field. So the origins of the sentiment in the American public, I think, dates back to the conclusion of the Vietnam War, where people had this notion that the military, and because obviously there was conscription at the time, people think that it's this obligatory, awful option, and you only choose the military lifestyle if you have no other options. And that persists to this day. And I think it was re-heightened in the early GWOT because they needed to fill the demand for new soldiers, and they weren't getting enough volunteers. So there was this active recruiting campaign, and then all kinds of allowances were made, and the standards for entry were lowered, as they always will be during wartime. So that remains to this day, and people have this negative perception about your day-to-day lifestyle. I mean, I remember when I first joined, somebody asked me if I live in a tent. And of course, I was staying in a barracks room that was nicer than a lot of college dorm rooms. And I was only in the Army for about a year at that point. So a lot of that stays. People think it's basically tantamount to going to prison. And they also have this mistaken notion that if you join the Army, number one, you're going to be a combat armed soldier and you're going to be exposed to all kinds of undue risk. And that you are going to have to kill people and you're going to be in harm's way a good portion of your time of service. And the reality is, I mean, it really couldn't be more disparate than that. There's an expanse of different job opportunities across the military, across the branches. You can basically be a civilian in uniform. You can be a tech guy, you can be a mechanic, you can be a cook, there's so many different jobs. So, and really there's almost one for every different interest, so many different specialties. And obviously the bulk of the numbers, at least for the Army, are going to be your combat armed soldiers, your cavalrymen, your artillerymen, and your infantrymen. But you are not forced into those assignments. You will have a range of different career paths available to you based on your performance in the Army's assessment test.
Yeah, I like the part where you hit on having no other option. I feel like it's very shocking to people when they find out that on average 50% of the US population has a degree. But if you go into the subsect of the US military, ranging from associates all the way up to doctorates, 80% of the military population holds a degree, the bachelor's being the largest chunk of that at almost 50%. And even masters and doctorates, though, make up 10% of the force. And then on average, the average male in the military, obviously averages and medians can be swayed by higher ends, right? But on average for males is $80,000 a year, and for females is $76,000 a year, which also is above the average for the rest of the United States population. So I think people can get easily dissuaded by low man on the totem pole, low pay, things like that. But they also need to remember their provided living, their provided food. You know, there's very low cost of living associated with that low pay until you make your way up into basically the military's version of upper management where you are now.
Right. So there's really two more factors that really contribute to this negative public perception. In addition to the hyperbolic assessment of what the risk is. Like you said, people think that if you are in the military, you're guaranteed to make a terrible income. And that is absolutely not true. Now, when you start off, when you are whatever, E1 through E3, the pay, admittedly, is not great. But when you combine that with all the benefits you receive, it actually equals to more than your civilian side entry level jobs. And with more time served, the amount of pay you receive goes up. And by the time that you are hitting whatever, 12, 15 years in the Army, or really any of the services, because the pay is comparable across the different branches, you are making a very substantial income, especially if you have a family. You get paid additional income for that to cover all your expenses. And then you get great health coverage and you get housing, and all these things add up, and you're in a very advantageous economic position. And
do you think it's potentially the recruiters aren't relaying this information in a flashy way to draw people in, or do you think there is a loss in public pride and nationalism to want to serve your country that's leading to the low percentages?
So that's the other factor I was getting to. The general negative view of the military that pervades society is the major reason that people aren't even going to go have that conversation with the recruiter. They're not even going to walk through those doors because, and I've had this conversation over and over with different people. I understand it's anecdotal, but people ask, what is the value of the military? And as a society, we're so naive. We're so used to existing in peacetime with no actual threat to the homeland that people stopped recognizing the utility of even having a standing army. People say, oh, why do you join? You just want to kill people? And they don't understand that if you don't have a substantial military presence, then you will see encroachment, and maybe your borders will be breached by invading hordes. It's just this absurd naivete, and it's culturally born, and it has its roots again in the Vietnam War. People just think that if we do nothing, if we reduce the size of our military, or our military ceases to exist, that we will face no threat. We'll just live on in peace and harmony. And I'm sure you've probably heard similar things. It's just ridiculous, and it's also bears out the failures of our educational system, that they have no historical context to reference the value of a powerful standing military.
Do you think there is any benefit to having mandatory service like some other countries do, like South Korea, or do you think that the force should stay 100% volunteer? Do you think that forced conscription for however long, year, two, couple months, would just breed more discontent amongst the populace?
So while the United States is still embroiled with small conflicts like the GWOT, I know people think GWOT was this wild, earth-shattering, world-shattering event. It really wasn't. It was a small war, and militarily, from beginning to end, we dominated the opposition. Dominated. Absolutely. There was no contest. There was no threat to the homeland. And so while we were engaged in that type of conflict, ones that we can easily handle or ones that we can fight with one arm behind our back, and I would even include conflicts like Vietnam and Korea, and those are also, it's that truth is borne out by the numbers. We did not send our entire military capability overseas in either of those conflicts. And really, conscription was not necessary during the Vietnam War. But I think if we are engaged in what will essentially be World War III with a near peer threat, I know we're overusing that term maybe, you will see a return of conscription. It's an inevitability. If a country's manpower limit or the number of manpower accessible is limited, and we have to project military power, then all those protections of no conscription are going to quickly evaporate. So you'll see a return to that. But I think for the meantime, for the interim, while we're engaged in not terribly threatening conflicts, we should retain that volunteer status army.
What are your thoughts on if we didn't go volunteer, and you do have a draft forced conscription? Do you think the same benefit should be applied to the individuals versus the volunteer force, like when it comes to the GI Bill and things like that? Or would that almost be an incentive to volunteer versus play the numbers game and see if you do get drafted?
I mean, again, it's hard to see, because if we're talking about conscription, we're talking about World War III, and everything is going to shift. But yes, for as long as we could sustain it, I say add as many incentives as you can. Conscription works in countries where individualism is not as prominent as it is in the United States. So conscription works in Israel. Conscription works in Switzerland. But here in America, where we're defined by this rugged American individualism and we hate being told what to do, it does not work well, and it doesn't foster strong esprit de corps, camaraderie, efficacy across a military organization.
Do you think the general populace is almost kind of shooting themselves in the foot when it comes to rising mental health issues and obesity that are making them automatically not eligible to join the military? Or when the time comes, do you think it won't matter and those things will just be waived anyways when push comes to shove?
Yes, a lot of those things are going to be waived. We saw this again with the initial invasion of Iraq. You had people with criminal records coming in, people with medical disabilities getting waived and joining and deploying. And that will happen once again. And every country in the world, if they're faced with a serious military threat, those vetting processes are going to get streamlined, usually to the detriment of the military organization.
Do you think there's anything on a national level that can be done or should be done to help cut down on some of those preventable things like obesity?
Perhaps not on a national level, but I would like to see the different media powers that be, I would like to see a return of nationalistic sentiment. And I know nationalism is like a dirty word, but nationalism also can be a catch-all for all types of um, beneficial aspects to a nation. So if you are nationalistic and you believe in the greatness of your country, then naturally you're going to try to improve your country because you care about it, you're invested in it. And part of that is improving yourself. So if we could maybe foster that type of outlook, um, and people that do feel strongly and proudly about their country um, would just vocalize that more, maybe we could see more unity, and people would start taking their obligation to their country more seriously. Because we do, if you're a conscientious person and you're not entitled, you're not a useless piece of crap, you will recognize that you have a duty to society and to the country at large. And part of that is by pulling your best qualities out, by nurturing them, by building yourself up.
Is there anything you think the military can do when it comes to like the Army Corps of Engineers creating and conducting projects, National Guard responding to natural disasters? Do you think there's anything the military could do on their end PR wise to get a better image?
Oh, absolutely. So lately, you've been seeing a shift in terms of military recruiting agenda. And they're trying to recruit from a demographic that would normally not be interested in the military anyway. And that is very strange to me. It's counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense. There is a specific demographic. It's young men that are patriotic that will continue to fill boots across the military. And so when we're adjusting our recruiting to cater to a demographic that doesn't care, that doesn't love the country anyway, and has no interest in serving, then obviously our numbers are going to continue to be low. So there's a lot that can be done. And I think we just need a little help. We need a little help from media, and we need help from the general population that are proud Americans, to try and build up what it means to be a soldier and in the public perception. And I'll give you a quick historical anecdote on that. So if you're familiar with the Victorian age, prior to the reign of Queen Victoria, soldiering, the profession of arms, was considered to be a fairly lowly thing. I mean, well beyond that, well before that, you had knighthood, and that was something to be aspired to. But for the interim between the age of chivalry and then the Victorian age, the profession of arms, soldiering, it was for the dregs of society. You were often, if you were a low-level criminal or something, they would offer you to send you to the army instead of doing some jail time. But you saw a phenomenon in Great Britain around the Victorian age where the public perception of soldiering changed. It dramatically shifted. And you saw all these glowing depictions of the heroism of the soldiers of empire, in their pith helmets with their Martini Henrys, building up, furthering the empire's interests, spreading advancement, progress across the globe. And that actually shifted British public opinion on the value of the military. And people started to see it as a viable career choice. And it was something honorable, something to be aspired to. And of course, in every culture, masculinity, standing up for the downtrodden, protecting the weak, these are all favorable positions. But you're seeing in America, all of these things are under assault, and like the traditional view of masculinity, of all these different things, it's changing, it's shifting. Heroism and being bold and brave, it now has a different meaning for a lot of the population. So I think if we can, the conservatives, I want to say, because the onus is really on conservatives to do this, because the left doesn't have a generally favorable opinion of the country and of our military. So it's on us to try and shift how the public views us. And I don't know exactly how we will do that. But I think it starts with the individual. And once you, in your immediate circle, start demonstrating your commitment and the things that are important to you, then it furthers these ideals in the broader population at large.
Do you think the military has a problem at all of being bad stewards of themselves? I've been reading a lot where numbers are at an all-time low for past military personnel to recommend military service to friends and family. So who better to be a spokesperson than someone that's lived that life, but then they're going out there and saying, you know what, to be honest, like, been there, done that, don't recommend it, you should try something else? Is that like a culture of just eating their own, poor leadership, or is that, even though it's at an all-time high, is that just a small disgruntled demographic?
Okay, so that's a complicated one, because its origins are all of those different things that you talked about. Yeah, there's some toxic leadership. Yeah, there's a lot of politics. Once you get into a leadership role in any branch, there's a lot of politics involved, and that is unfortunate because it's subjective judgments rather than merit-based judgments, and that's just something you have to contend with. But that's the reality of any hierarchy or any organization. You're going to have to deal with that. So is some of it founded? Yes. Will you be treated like just a number at different points of your career? Absolutely. And a lot of the work you're going to do is wholly unglamorous and maybe well outside of your job description. But that is the reality that you have to accept. If you're going into the military, into, as I like to say, the profession of arms, you should understand what that entails. You should know that what is going to be asked of you is going to be well beyond your average civilian job. And recognizing that, you're going to have to put up with a lot of basically bullshit. But there is honor, there is pride in doing the job regardless, despite all the nonsense, despite the minutia, the mundanity. It's a specific set of unfortunate circumstances that you're going to have to contend with. And you just need to accept it. So ideally, you want people that are capable of understanding that to join the military, because they can put things in perspective and then they won't leave all disgruntled when they don't get exactly what they want. Unfortunately, people are individuals and they don't all think like that. So you will have people that maybe do stay in a very long time and they're still disgruntled, and they're going to negatively impact someone else's likelihood of joining up.
In this day and age, do you think there's even the right type of person for the military to fill all ranks when we live in a day and age where not just toxic masculinity at this point, but any kind of form of masculinity appears to be given this pervasive title where men shouldn't be men? And obviously women serve in the military as well, but I think most people would notice women serving in the military are a small, lesser percentage, and the women that do that, who partake in that, definitely have a type of aura about them that is contradictive to the general female in today's populace.
So yes, I think it's a shockingly low number. I think it's estimated, and this is from a recent study, that less than 23% of the population or the demographic of 17 to 24-year-olds qualify for military service. And that is in large part, well, primarily it's because physically they're not capable of serving, of meeting the bare minimum requirements. But beyond that, of those 22, 23% that are eligible for service, A good chunk of them also don't have the right mentality. They're going in there either as a last-ditch effort, or they're going in there with the mentality that they're going to be an individual and that the Army needs to change to suit whatever specific needs they feel they're entitled to. And I've encountered this as a leader very often, where you get a young soldier and they're fresh out of basic training, and usually they're one of two ways. Either they are very robotic and they've been imbued with that discipline as basic training is supposed to do to you, or they have this sense that they're already there, they made it, and the Army now needs to change to suit them. And the soldiers that come in with that sense of entitlement, they are very hard to work with. And oftentimes they are self-destructive in their tendencies because they think that the world has some obligation to change its rules so that they can get what they want. And usually they have a short career, and I mean, if they even make it to the end of their term of service. And that's just something that's socially ingrained, and it's a byproduct of something positive, I think, and that is the rugged individualism aspect of the American public. But there's also this entitlement, and some of that is generational as well, where each newer generation feels like they're owed more from society, from other people, and they take less personal responsibility for whatever they find dissatisfactory in their own lives. And so that's just an ongoing issue. We're going to have to continue to contend with that. And if people weren't fathered properly, if they didn't have discipline growing up, and they are ingrained with this sense of entitlement, they're going to make awful soldiers. And that's the common thread that I see when you do have a soldier that just fails or they flail wildly. A lot of times it is just youth and they need to grow and they need to be mentored. But some of them, they have this self-destructive streak, and it's born out of entitlement and no knowledge of what traditional masculinity entails.
Yeah, I like that take. The military is kind of the ultimate team, and if you don't have the discipline to put the team before yourself, you're just only going to be a hindrance to the team. But just wanted to thank you for coming on. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your insight on all those things. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, this has been the latest episode of Pondering Pennies.